When they came to the end of the hall and the door was opened again, Haldir suddenly felt very self-conscious. There were many elves in the main hall at the moment, and they all stopped what they were doing and stared at the group. Namo went on as though he didn't notice, which might have been true, as, with time, he had probably gotten used to it. Haldir tried to ignore the stares as well, but with little success. In the end, he was brought to simply looking down at the ground in front of his feet. Haldir soon realized, however, that the elves quickly lost interest in him, and even with Namo, as they saw Sauron. Most of them seemed unable to figure out who he was, which suited Haldir fine. All the same, there were some older elves in the groups who almost seemed as though they recognized him. If they did, they made no sign. Haldir almost thought that he was going to be able to get out of the main hall without mishap. For a glorious moment, it seemed as though they might get through without anybody right out saying that it was Sauron. That being the case, nobody present who knew Haldir would even be able to consider what sort of mess he was getting into. He had just let out a breath, finally beginning to relax, when Feanor entered the hall. As soon as he saw him, he knew there would be trouble. Feanor stopped dead in his tracks, staring at Sauron with an utterly shocked expression on. Namo seemed to realize the danger and began to walk over to Feanor to push him back into the hall he had just been in, but it was already too late. Feanor's shocked face very quickly turned venomous, hard, and cold as stone. Haldir had never seen him that way in the likely thousands of times he had seen Feanor. The blubbering, complaining Feanor Haldir had known had erased any memory of the tales he had been told as a child, the ones in which Feanor had been strong-willed and stoic. Now he was getting to see that side of him, however, and he wasn't so sure that it was much better. A fiery gleam seemed to leap in his eyes, and for once Haldir understood how he had earned the Spirit of Fire name. Feanor steamed silently for a moment, but Haldir deemed that it was nowhere near long enough.
"What are you doing here?"
he asked coldly. At his words, Sauron seemed to notice that Feanor was there for the first time.
Feanor,
he began, his voice hinting at an equal amount of enmity.
What have you been up to these last, 25,000 years? Locked away here, while I have been out free.
Feanor's rage was easy to comprehend, yet he did a good job of concealing it.
"The usual things you do when you are without a body. I am sure that you would know all about those things, though, as you have been without a body yourself. What, 6 times now? Your ability to lose bodies in completely idiotic and degrading ways is quite amazing,"
he answered snidely. Whispering rose around them as everybody began to realize that it was really Sauron. A couple began to yell and worked their way over to Feanor, standing behind him like a small army. Haldir wanted to slide off to the side, but thought that might have brought more attention to himself than if he'd stayed. Sauron was less able to hold down his fury, and he seemed to almost shake. Evidently Feanor had hit a touchy spot. At the same time, he was able to frighten off all of the elves who had been standing behind Feanor. Haldir did not want to know how.
To start with, I believe it to be 7, counting recent events, and I must relinquish what awe I might receive for losing bodies to your talent for losing everything that is important to you in equally daft manners.
He tossed his head back slightly, as though daring Feanor to make a move. Apparently that was the last straw, and Feanor screamed and ran towards Sauron, trying to find some way to harm him, although that seemed very unlikely. For a moment, Haldir watched in interest to see what would happen, but one of the men who had been holding Sauron let go and grabbed Feanor as he came within striking distance. Sauron merely laughed as Feanor struggled to get loose, which, of course, only made Feanor angrier.
"Let's not forget what things you've had taken from you!"
he yelled at Sauron. Sauron smiled coolly.
You don't need to say body, as you have brought that up already.
Feanor shook his head.
"No, I was just going to list off about everything else that you could possibly possess, seeing as how you have been reduced to nothing."
Finally, Sauron, in turn, seemed to have reached his breaking point and began to pull at his restrainer in hopes of catching Feanor. There was a brief struggle that followed that Haldir could not see completely, but when it was over, Sauron was loose and was plowing his way over to Feanor. If Haldir thought the little exchange had been entertaining, what followed was even more so. Feanor had also managed to wiggle out from the hold of the man, and now they both began to kick and hit each other in any way they could. That seemed strange to Haldir, though, as he had always thought that bodiless spirits had been unable to touch. He looked at the person next to him and tentatively reached out a hand to see what happened. His translucent fingers had just passed through the elf's arm when he realized that she was looking at him.
Hello,
he said, giving an uncomfortable smile. The she-elf just shook her head and walked away. All the same, he had just figured out that it would be impossible for Sauron and Feanor to actually be fighting. Looking closer at them now, he realized that they weren't really able to land any blows as their hands or feet simply passed through the other. While they attempted to hurt each other, tempting being the key word, they began to sling insults.
"I never go so low as to slay my kin,"
Sauron said as he batted at Feanor's non-existent hands.
You don't even have any kin. It would be impossible to kill something that didn't exist, dolt.
"Fairy."
The word is elf. Besides, I'm not the one obsessed with jewelry.
Sauron made a face.
"What are you talking about? Yes, you are."
No, I am not.
"What were the Cimmerils, then? Huh?"
Feanor actually paused.
Oh yeah, you have a point there.
"And I didn't even know how to make rings like I did until your grandson and his cronies taught me."
Well, at least I didn't go out and seek that knowledge.
"You wouldn't have to. You figured it out on your own, you little pansy."
Well, shows how intelligent I am compared to you. If a lowly elf could learn how to make rings and a Maya couldn't.
I just wasn't as desperate as you were. You're like a little girly elf.
Sauron stopped a minute as something seemed to occur to him, frowning thoughtfully before raising his eyebrows in surprise.
"You really are a fairy."
You already tried that before. Can't you think of a better comeback than a previously used one?
"No, I seriously mean it. You
He looked at Feanor oddly, frowning.
have problems."
Everybody else in hearing distance slowly began to murmur to each other as the intended message of this sunk in. Haldir cocked an eyebrow.
well, this could be interesting.
He thought to himself. Feanor looked absolutely appalled.
Oh no, no.
He cried angrily, going at Sauron with doubled effort. Sauron, however, did not fight, but retreated slowly as Feanor came after him.
"Your greatest prize, the thing you went to war for, was jewelry. You were obsessed with your niece's hair, and asked her for some on several occasions."
3 times, only 3.
Feanor tried to put in quickly, but few heard.
"You never spent time with your wife, and that is why she left you.
I have 7 sons, though, honestly now.
And you lived way up north for years with only men. It makes sense now."
Sauron paused again and grimaced.
"I do not want to fight you anymore."
Giving up then, eh?
Feanor asked.
"Not giving up, really. More like simply putting a stop to the fight. You might make a pass on me or something."
Sauron shuddered and then began to walk over to where Namo was shaking his head sadly.
"Right then. I'm ready to get out of here now."
The guards moved to restrain him again, but he quickly turned to them.
"Where do you think I'm going to run to? You think I want to stay here without a body? No. I want to go get out as soon as I can. I'm going to behave. For now."
The men looked at Namo, who just shrugged. Then they backed off and allowed Sauron to make his way over to the hall that Namo was standing in front of. Feanor did not hinder Sauron's movement, seeming to be incapable of moving himself. A rather stupid expression was printed on his face, somewhere between shock, disgust, amazement, and horror. After a moment, Namo seemed to return to the present and slowly began to go back the way he had been going, Sauron following closely behind, now without the guards holding him. The gears in his brain taking a minute to catch up to everything, Haldir remembered that he was part of that party, and followed after them.